The prison was a gray box, a place where the sun seemed to forget to shine. Inside, Mark lived a life measured in footsteps and stale bread. Each clang of the metal doors echoed in his soul, a constant reminder of his mistakes. He was just another number in a system that didn't care about names or stories. He spent most of his days in his small cell, staring at the chipped paint on the walls, trying to remember what freedom felt like. Mark wasn't always a prisoner. He used to have a life, a family, a future. But one bad decision, fueled by desperation, landed him here. Now, he was trapped, not just by the walls and bars, but by the weight of his past. He tried to stay out of trouble, keep his head down. Prison was a dangerous place, and he knew he had to be careful. There were gangs and rivalries, and it was easy to get caught in the middle. He missed the simple things, like the taste of fresh air and the sound of laughter. He missed his family, especially his younger brother, David. David. Just thinking his name brought a mix of pain and regret. They hadn't spoken in years, not since before the trial. Mark knew he had hurt David deeply, and he didn't blame him for wanting nothing to do with him. But sometimes, late at night, when the prison was quiet, Mark would imagine what it would be like to see David again, to apologize for everything. He noticed a new guard making rounds in his block. The man looked young, maybe in his early 20s, with kind eyes and a hesitant demeanor. He seemed different from the other guards, less hardened, more human. Mark tried not to make eye contact, but he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something, a sense of familiarity. The guard's name tag read D. Bell. It couldn't be, could it? It had been so long, and David had probably changed a lot. But the more Mark watched him, the more he became convinced. The way he walked, the way he held his head, it was David. His little brother, now a prison guard. The irony wasn't lost on him. His own brother, the one he had let down so badly, was now one of the people keeping him locked up. It was a cruel twist of fate, or maybe, just maybe, it was something more. A chance. David felt the weight of the keys on his belt, each one a symbol of his responsibility, his duty. He walked the sterile hallways, the scent of disinfectant clinging to the air, a constant reminder of the confinement within these walls. He tried to remain detached, professional, but it was hard. Especially now. He had requested this assignment, knowing, or at least suspecting, that Mark was here. It had been a difficult decision, one that had kept him up at night for weeks. Part of him wanted nothing to do with Mark, to erase him from his memory. But another part, a stubborn, persistent ember of brotherly love, refused to let go. He remembered their childhood, the scraped knees and shared secrets, the treehouse they built together in the woods behind their house. Mark had always been the protector, the older brother who looked out for him. David had idolized him. Then came the fall. The crime, the trial, the shame that had washed over their family. David had felt betrayed, abandoned. Mark's actions had shattered their lives, and David had struggled to pick up the pieces. He had built a new life for himself, a life of order and discipline. He joined the Corrections Academy, seeking a sense of purpose, a way to make a difference. He wanted to believe he was helping people, keeping the community safe. But now, seeing Mark in this place, he questioned everything. He avoided Mark's cell at first, trying to convince himself that it wasn't him, that he was mistaken. But the longer he worked in the block, the more certain he became. It was Mark. Older, weathered, but undeniably Mark. He saw the haunted look in his eyes, the way he carried himself with a weary resignation. David felt a war raging inside him. Duty versus loyalty, anger versus forgiveness. He knew he should report Mark if he suspected anything, maintain order, follow the rules. But the thought of turning his back on his brother, of condemning him to this existence, was unbearable. He was trapped between his past and his present, between his responsibilities and his heart. He knew that whatever he decided, it would change his life forever. The weight of the keys on his belt felt heavier than ever. He started to wonder if helping his brother was worth losing everything he had built. The accidental encounter happened during the evening meal. Mark was shuffling through the line, picking at the tasteless slop they called food, when he saw David. David was supervising the inmates, his gaze sweeping across the room, carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone in particular. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't been this close to David in years. He wanted to say something, anything, but he knew he couldn't. Not here, not now. He just kept his head down and moved forward, trying to control his breathing. As he passed David, their eyes met for a split second. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but Mark saw it. A flicker of recognition, a hint of pain, a shadow of something he couldn't quite decipher. It was enough. He knew David knew. David quickly looked away, his face hardening into a mask of indifference. He continued his rounds, his steps measured and deliberate. But Mark could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched. He knew this was affecting David, just as much as it was affecting him. Back in his cell, Mark replayed the moment over and over in his mind. That brief eye contact was the only communication they had shared, but it spoke volumes. It confirmed what Mark had suspected: David was here, and he knew who Mark was. The silence between them was deafening. Mark wondered what David was thinking, what he was planning. Was he going to report him? Was he going to pretend he didn't know him? Or was there a chance, a slim chance, that he might be willing to help? That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing. He knew he had to do something, take a risk. He couldn't just sit here and wait for David to make a move. He had to reach out, to break the ice, to let David know how desperate he was. But how? How could he communicate with him without risking exposure, without putting David in danger? He needed a plan, a way to reach his brother, to plead his case, to ask for forgiveness, and maybe, just maybe, to ask for help. The weight of his situation pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He knew this was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. He had to try. His future, his freedom, depended on it. And maybe, just maybe, so did his relationship with his brother. The next day, Mark hatched a plan. He knew it was risky, but he didn't see any other way. During laundry duty, inmates were allowed to write their names on their bags with a small stub of a pencil. Mark carefully sharpened his pencil on the rough concrete floor until the lead was as fine as he could get it. He then tore a small strip from the inside of his shirt, a piece of fabric that wouldn't be noticed missing. Back in his cell, he painstakingly wrote a short message on the fabric: "David, it's me, Mark. I need your help. Please." He knew it was a long shot, but it was the best he could do. He folded the tiny note as small as possible, then waited for the right moment. The opportunity came during David's evening rounds. As David approached his cell, Mark pretended to drop his spoon. He quickly bent down, accidentally dropping the tiny note near David's feet. He made sure to make eye contact with David again, hoping he would understand. David hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking down to the scrap of fabric. He quickly glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then subtly nudged the note under his boot. He continued his rounds, his face betraying nothing. Mark held his breath, his heart pounding. Had David seen it? Had he understood? He wouldn't know until later. The waiting was agonizing. Later that night, after the lights were out, Mark heard a faint rustling outside his cell. He strained his ears, listening intently. Then, he heard a soft whisper, barely audible: "Mark." It was David. Mark's heart leaped. He whispered back, "David, is that you?" "Yes," David replied, his voice hushed. "I got your note. What do you want?" Mark's mind raced. He had to be careful, choose his words wisely. "I need to talk to you," he whispered. "It's important." "I can't stay long," David said. "This is risky enough as it is." "I know," Mark replied. Can we meet somewhere? Somewhere we can talk without being overheard. David was silent for a moment. Then, he said, the laundry room. Tomorrow night, after the last shift. Be there. And with that, he was gone. Mark lay in his bunk, his mind buzzing. He had made contact. He had a chance. But he knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge was yet to come. He had to convince David to help him, to risk everything for him. And he knew that wasn't going to be easy. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine what tomorrow night would bring. Hope, fear, desperation, they all swirled inside him, a chaotic mix of emotions. The laundry room was a steamy, noisy place, filled with the rumble of machines and the smell of detergent. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting, a place where hushed voices could be easily lost in the din. Mark waited nervously, his heart pounding in his chest. He had managed to slip away from his cell block unnoticed, but he knew he didn't have much time. Then, he saw David. He was standing in the shadows, his face obscured by the dim lighting. He looked tense, wary. Mark approached him cautiously. David, he said, his voice barely a whisper. David nodded, his eyes scanning the room. We don't have much time, he said. What do you want? Mark took a deep breath. I need your help, he said. I know I don't deserve it, not after everything I've done. But I'm desperate. David's expression remained unreadable. What kind of help? He asked. I need to get out of here, Mark said. I can't stay here, David. I won't survive. David scoffed. You think I'm just going to let you walk out of here? I'm a guard, Mark. I have a job to do. I know, Mark said. But you're also my brother. And I know there's still some good in you, David. I know you haven't forgotten about us, about what we used to be. David was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. It's not that simple, Mark, he said. If I help you, I could lose everything. My job, my freedom, everything. I know the risk you'd be taking, Mark said. And I wouldn't ask you if I didn't think it was the only way. I'm in danger here, David. There are people who want to hurt me. I can't tell you why, but you have to believe me. David looked at Mark, his eyes filled with doubt and confusion. What do you want me to do? He asked. I have a plan, Mark said. But I can't do it alone. I need your help. I need you to trust me. He explained his idea, a daring and risky scheme that would require David's cooperation and put them both in grave danger. As he spoke, David's expression shifted from skepticism to something akin to understanding. He listened intently, asking questions, probing for weaknesses in the plan. When Mark was finished, David remained silent for a long time. The only sound was the rumble of the washing machines and the pounding of Mark's heart. Finally, David spoke. This is insane, he said. It'll never work. But Mark saw something in his eyes, a flicker of hope, a hint of willingness. He knew he hadn't completely convinced him yet, but he had planted the seed. Now, all he had to do was wait and hope that his brother would choose family over duty. He knew it was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. The stakes were higher than ever. The laundry room became their sanctuary, a place where, amidst the grime and the noise, they could be brothers again. Night after night, they met, their conversations hushed and hurried, always looking over their shoulders. The escape plan was always present, a looming possibility, but it wasn't the only thing they discussed. They talked about their childhood, about their parents, about the good old days before everything fell apart. They laughed about silly memories, like the time they tried to build a raft and it sank in the creek, or the time Mark accidentally set the kitchen on fire trying to make cookies. These shared memories were a lifeline, a reminder of the bond that still connected them, despite everything. David asked about prison life, about the other inmates, about the dangers Mark faced. He listened intently, his face etched with concern. Mark, in turn, asked about David's life, about his job, about his hopes and dreams. He learned that David had never married, that he lived a quiet, solitary life. He sensed a deep loneliness in his brother, a yearning for connection that mirrored his own. Inevitably, the conversation would turn to the crime that had landed Mark in prison. It was a difficult topic, a raw wound that had never fully healed. Mark explained what had happened, the circumstances that had led him to make such a terrible mistake. He didn't try to excuse his actions, but he tried to help David understand. He talked about the desperation he had felt, the pressure he had been under. David listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He still struggled to reconcile the brother he had known with the man who had committed such a heinous act. But he was beginning to see things from Mark's perspective, to understand the forces that had shaped him. During one of these meetings, Mark finally apologized. He poured out his heart, expressing his deep regret for the pain he had caused David and their family. He begged for forgiveness, not expecting it, but needing to say it. David didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his eyes filled with tears. Then, he reached out and hugged Mark, a long, tight embrace that spoke volumes. It wasn't a complete absolution, but it was a start. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, their relationship could be salvaged. These secret meetings in the laundry room were more than just planning sessions. They were a chance for two brothers to reconnect, to heal old wounds, to rebuild a broken bond. They were a testament to the enduring power of family, even in the darkest of circumstances. And they were a glimmer of hope in a place where hope was a rare and precious commodity. They began to realize that they needed each other, regardless of the past. One night, the atmosphere in the laundry room was different. Mark was more agitated than usual, his eyes darting nervously around the room. David noticed the change immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Mark hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I'm in danger, David," he said. "I can't tell you everything, but there are people inside who want to hurt me. Badly." David's face hardened. "Who?" he demanded. "Tell me who, and I'll report them." "I can't," Mark said. "If I tell you, it'll only make things worse. For both of us. Just trust me, David. I'm not safe here." David struggled to process this new information. He had known prison was a dangerous place, but he hadn't fully grasped the extent of the threat Mark faced. The thought of his brother being harmed, of being unable to protect him, filled him with a chilling sense of dread. "What do they want?" David asked. "Why are they after you?" "It doesn't matter," Mark said. "The only thing that matters is getting me out of here. I can't stay here any longer, David. I'm running out of time." He grabbed David's arm, his grip tight. "You have to help me," he pleaded. "I'm begging you. I don't want to die in this place." David looked at Mark, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He saw the fear in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. He knew Mark was telling the truth. He was in real danger. The weight of the decision pressed down on David, heavier than ever before. He knew that helping Mark escape would be a betrayal of his duty, a violation of the law. It would jeopardize his career, his freedom, his entire future. But he also knew that he couldn't stand by and watch his brother be harmed, possibly killed. He thought about their childhood, about the promises they had made to each other, about the unbreakable bond that had once existed between them. He thought about their parents, about how devastated they would be if anything happened to Mark. He thought about his own conscience, about whether he could live with himself if he turned his back on his brother in his hour of need. The moral dilemma was tearing him apart. He was trapped between his head and his heart, between his responsibilities and his love. He knew that whatever he decided, there would be consequences. But he also knew that he couldn't remain neutral any longer. He had to choose. He had to decide whether he was willing to risk everything to save his brother's life. The clock was ticking, and the stakes were higher than ever before. He felt the pressure building, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate him. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it fast. Mark's life depended on it. David couldn't sleep. He lay in his small, Spartan apartment, the image of Mark's desperate face burned into his mind. He tossed and turned, his thoughts a jumbled mess of memories and anxieties. He remembered a summer day, years ago, when he was 8 and Mark was 12. They were playing in the woods behind their house when David fell and broke his arm. Mark had carried him all the way home, his small body struggling under David's weight. David remembered the pain, but he also remembered the unwavering determination in Mark's eyes, the fierce protectiveness that had always defined their relationship. He remembered another time, when he was being bullied at school. Mark had stood up for him, facing down the older boys without hesitation. David had always looked up to Mark, admired his courage, his strength. Mark had always been his hero. But then, the memories shifted, turning darker. He remembered the day he found out about Mark's crime, the shock and disbelief that had washed over him. He remembered the trial, the shame, the whispers, the way their family had been ostracized. He remembered the moment the verdict was read, the crushing weight of disappointment and betrayal. He imagined the consequences of helping Mark escape. He would be arrested, charged with aiding and abetting a fugitive. He would lose his job, his reputation, his freedom. He would become an outcast, just like Mark. His life, the life he had worked so hard to build, would be ruined. He pictured himself in a prison cell, just like Mark, separated from everything he held dear. He imagined the disappointment in his parents' eyes, the judgment in the faces of his colleagues. He imagined the loneliness, the isolation, the despair. He knew that helping Mark escape would be the most reckless, irresponsible thing he could do. It would be a betrayal of everything he stood for, everything he had worked for. It would be a disaster. But then, he thought about Mark, alone and vulnerable in that dangerous place. He thought about the fear in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. He thought about the possibility that Mark could be harmed, even killed. He couldn't shake the image of Mark carrying him home after he broke his arm, the unwavering determination in his eyes. He couldn't forget the times Mark had stood up for him, protected him from harm. He couldn't ignore the bond that still connected them, despite everything. He knew that if he didn't help Mark, he would never be able to live with himself. He would be haunted by guilt and regret for the rest of his life. He would know that he had turned his back on his brother in his hour of need, and that he had chosen duty over family. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the conflicting thoughts and emotions that were tearing him apart. He knew he had to make a decision, and he had to make it soon. The stakes were higher than ever before. He had to decide whether he was willing to risk everything to save his brother's life. The answer, he realized, was already in his heart. He just had to find the courage to act on it. He knew it would be the hardest thing he had ever done, but he also knew that it was the right thing to do. For Mark, and for himself. He had to help his brother, no matter the cost. Back in the laundry room, David laid out the plan, his voice low and serious. "It's the only way I can see this working," he said, "but it's incredibly risky. One slip up, and we're both done for." The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. David would get Mark a guard uniform, an old one that was slightly too big for him. During the shift change, when there was the most confusion and movement, Mark would disguise himself as a guard and walk out with David. "The biggest risk is the main gate," David explained. "That's where they check IDs, where they're the most vigilant. We have to be perfect." He paused, looking Mark in the eye. "Can you pull this off? Can you act like a guard? Can you keep your cool under pressure?" Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. "I have to," he said. "I don't have a choice." David outlined the details, the exact time of the shift change, the route they would take, the phrases Mark needed to memorize. He emphasized the importance of blending in, of not drawing attention to themselves. "You have to walk with confidence," David said. "You have to look like you belong there. No hesitation, no nervousness. Just act like you're heading to your post. He warned Mark about the guards they were most likely to encounter, their habits, their personalities. He told him what to say if they were stopped, how to deflect suspicion. "There's one guard, Miller," David said, his voice grim. "He's been here for 20 years. He knows everyone, he sees everything. If he gets a whiff of something wrong, he'll be all over us." He explained that Miller had a sharp eye and a knack for spotting inconsistencies. If Miller questioned them, they would have to be ready with a believable alibi. The plan relied on a series of calculated risks, a delicate dance between deception and luck. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance they had. "This is going to be the hardest thing we've ever done," David said. "We have to be prepared for anything. And we have to trust each other completely." He stressed the importance of communication, of being able to read each other's signals. They would have to rely on unspoken cues, on subtle gestures, to navigate the treacherous path ahead. "If anything goes wrong," David said, "we have to be ready to improvise. We have to be ready to think on our feet. And we have to be ready to accept the consequences." He knew that the plan was fraught with danger, that the odds were stacked against them. But he also knew that he had to try. He couldn't let Mark down. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it, no matter the cost. He just hoped they both made it out alive. The next few weeks were a blur of clandestine activity and mounting tension. David meticulously gathered the supplies they needed, each task fraught with risk. The uniform was the most challenging. David couldn't just take one, that would be too obvious. He had to find a way to borrow one without anyone noticing. He started working extra shifts in the supply room, volunteering to help with inventory. He learned the procedures, the routines, the blind spots. One night, when he was alone in the supply room, he found a slightly damaged uniform, one that was supposed to be discarded. He quickly stuffed it into a laundry bag, hoping no one would see him. His heart pounded in his chest as he carried the bag out of the room, his mind racing with possibilities. The ID was another hurdle. David knew he couldn't use his own, that would be too dangerous. He needed a spare, one that wouldn't be missed. He spent hours poring over personnel files, memorizing names and faces. He finally found one that belonged to a guard who was on extended leave, a guard who rarely came to the prison. He carefully copied the information onto a blank ID card, using a stolen laminator to make it look authentic. It was a risky move, but he knew it was essential. Without a valid ID, Mark wouldn't stand a chance of getting past the main gate. David also spent countless hours studying the shift patterns, memorizing the schedules of the guards, identifying the times when security was at its weakest. He noted the routines of the guards at the main gate, their habits, their blind spots. He learned which guards were the most vigilant, and which ones were the most easily distracted. He discovered that the shift change was the most chaotic time of the day, a period of organized confusion when guards were rushing to their posts, when communication was often garbled, when mistakes were more likely to happen. This was their window of opportunity. As David gathered the supplies and studied the patterns, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He knew that he was walking a dangerous line, that one wrong move could have devastating consequences. But he also knew that he couldn't turn back. He had made a promise to Mark, and he intended to keep it, no matter the cost. The suspense was almost unbearable. Each day felt like an eternity, each task a test of his nerve. He knew that the escape was imminent, that the moment of truth was fast approaching. He tried to prepare himself mentally, to steel himself for the challenges ahead. He knew that he would have to be strong, that he would have to be brave, that he would have to be willing to sacrifice everything to save his brother's life. He just hoped he was up to the task. The weight of the world was on his shoulders, and he knew that the fate of 2 lives rested in his hands. The closer they got to the escape date, the more paranoid David became. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, convinced that someone was watching him. His anxiety was starting to show, and it didn't go unnoticed. Guard Johnson, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, had started to pay extra attention to David. He had noticed David spending extra time in the supply room, poring over personnel files, and studying shift patterns. He had seen the nervous glances, the furtive movements. He didn't know what David was up to, but he suspected something was wrong. One afternoon, Johnson confronted David in the break room. "You seem a little preoccupied lately, Bell," he said, his eyes narrowed. "Everything all right?" David's heart skipped a beat. He knew he had to be careful, that one wrong word could blow everything. He forced himself to remain calm, to meet Johnson's gaze without flinching. "Yeah, everything's fine," David said, trying to sound casual. "Just a little stressed, that's all. We've been short-staffed lately, and the workload has been heavy." Johnson didn't seem convinced. "You've been spending a lot of time in the supply room," he said. "Anything I should know about?" David's mind raced. He needed an explanation, something believable, something that would satisfy Johnson's curiosity. He decided to play on Johnson's own ambition. "I've been looking into ways to improve our inventory system," David said. "It's outdated and inefficient. I thought I could come up with some suggestions to streamline the process, make things easier for everyone." Johnson's expression softened slightly. He was always complaining about the outdated inventory system. "You think you can do that?" he asked. "I'm willing to try," David said. "I've got some ideas, but I need to do some more research." Johnson nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "But keep me in the loop, okay? I want to know what you're up to." David breathed a sigh of relief. He had managed to divert Johnson's suspicion, at least for now. But he knew he had to be more careful, that he couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. As Johnson walked away, David felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that Johnson was watching him, that he was waiting for him to slip up. He had to be extra vigilant, extra cautious. The stakes were higher than ever before. He realized that he had underestimated the risks, that he had been too focused on the details of the escape plan to notice the warning signs. He had become complacent, and it had almost cost him everything. From that moment on, David was on high alert. He tried to act normal, to go about his duties as usual, but he was constantly aware of Johnson's presence, of the feeling that he was being watched. He knew that he couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. The escape was just days away, and he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. His brother's life, and his own, depended on it. The pressure was immense, but he refused to crack. He had come too far to give up now. The night of the escape was thick with tension, a palpable weight that hung heavy in the air. Mark lay in his bunk, his senses on high alert, every nerve ending screaming. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, sharpening his focus, amplifying his fears. He knew that tonight was it. Tonight, he would either taste freedom or face the dire consequences of failure. He had to be ready, mentally and physically. He had to be prepared to execute the plan flawlessly, to trust David completely, to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had managed to get his hands on a smuggled razor blade, a small, rusty piece of metal that was worth its weight in gold inside these walls. He used it to shave his head, mirroring the short, cropped hairstyle of the guards. The cold steel against his skin was a stark reminder of the stakes, a symbol of the transformation he was about to undergo. As he shaved his head, he stared at his reflection in the small, cracked mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. The years in prison had taken their toll, etching lines of hardship and despair onto his face. He looked older, harder, more cynical. But beneath the surface, he still saw a glimmer of hope, a flicker of determination. He began to mentally rehearse his role, repeating the phrases David had taught him, practicing the confident stride, visualizing the route he would take. He imagined himself walking past the guards, their faces impassive, their eyes unseeing. He imagined himself reaching the main gate, presenting the ID, and walking out into the night. He knew that the key to success was confidence, that he had to project an air of authority, of belonging. He had to convince everyone that he was a guard, that he had every right to be there. He couldn't afford to hesitate, to stumble, to show any sign of nervousness. He thought about David, about the risks he was taking, about the sacrifices he was making. He felt a surge of gratitude, a deep sense of loyalty. He knew that he owed it to David to make this work, that he couldn't let him down. He closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart. He took a deep breath, focusing on the present moment. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past, or to worry about the future. All that mattered was tonight, this moment, this opportunity. He knew that the odds were stacked against him, that the chances of success were slim. But he also knew that he had to try. He had to fight for his freedom, for his life. He had nothing to lose, and everything to gain. The prison was quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional clang of a distant door and the rhythmic snores of his fellow inmates. He knew that soon, that silence would be shattered, that the night would be filled with chaos and uncertainty. But he was ready. He was prepared. He was determined to make it out of here, to start a new life, to repay David for his extraordinary act of bravery. He just hoped he lived to see the sunrise. The appointed hour arrived, and David slipped into Mark's cell, his face pale in the dim light. He carried the guard uniform, folded neatly under his arm. The air in the cell was thick with anticipation and dread. "It's time," David whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood up, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. He stripped off his prison uniform, the coarse fabric falling to the floor like a discarded skin. David unfolded the guard uniform, the crisp material crackling in the silence. He held it out to Mark, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. As Mark slipped into the uniform, David helped him adjust the fit, smoothing out the wrinkles, straightening the collar. The uniform was slightly too big, but it would have to do. The moment was charged with emotion, a complex blend of vulnerability and brotherly connection. They were two brothers, reunited after years of estrangement, bound together by a desperate plan that could change their lives forever. As David buttoned the uniform, his fingers brushed against Mark's hand. He paused, his eyes meeting Mark's. In that brief moment, they exchanged a silent message of love and support, a promise to protect each other, no matter what. David stepped back, his eyes scanning Mark from head to toe. He assessed the disguise, looking for any flaws, any inconsistencies. He straightened Mark's shoulders, adjusted his cap, and checked the ID card. "You look like a guard," David said, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "But you have to act like one. Remember everything we talked about. Confidence, authority, no hesitation." He reminded Mark of the phrases he needed to memorize, the route he needed to take, the guards he was most likely to encounter. He stressed the importance of blending in, of not drawing attention to himself. "This is it, Mark," David said, his voice trembling slightly. "There's no turning back now. Are you ready?" Mark took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on David's. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm and resolute. David reached out and clasped Mark's shoulder, his grip tight. "I'm with you," he said. "Every step of the way." Together, they walked out of the cell, into the dimly lit corridor. The journey to freedom had begun. The air was electric, the tension palpable. They knew that they were walking a tightrope, that one wrong step could send them both plummeting into the abyss. But they were determined to succeed, to make it out of here alive, to start a new life, together. They just hoped their luck would hold. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear, they were in this together, brothers to the end. The walk through the prison corridors was an agonizing test of nerve. Every step was a gamble, every encounter a potential disaster. Mark focused on maintaining his composure, on projecting an air of authority, on blending in with the other guards. David took the lead, his presence providing a shield of legitimacy. He walked with purpose, his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed ahead. He greeted the other guards with a curt nod, using the familiar phrases they had rehearsed. "Evening, Johnson," David said to a passing guard, his voice casual. "Bell," Johnson replied, his eyes lingering on Mark for a moment before moving on. Mark kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, but he could feel Johnson's gaze burning into him. He knew that Johnson was suspicious, that he was watching them, waiting for them to slip up. They passed several other guards, each encounter a heart-stopping moment of tension. Mark recited the phrases in his head, reminding himself to breathe, to stay calm. He focused on matching David's stride, on mirroring his movements, on becoming invisible. As they neared the main gate, the atmosphere grew even more tense. Mark could see the guards on duty, their faces stern and watchful. He could hear the clanging of metal doors, the shouting of orders, the constant hum of activity. David slowed his pace, signaling Mark to do the same. He scanned the area, assessing the situation, identifying any potential threats. "All right, let's do this," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "Remember, confidence. And don't say a word unless you have to." They approached the main gate, their steps measured and deliberate. The guards on duty eyed them with suspicion, their eyes scrutinizing Mark's uniform, his ID card, his every move. David presented his ID, his voice firm and authoritative. "Shift change," he said. "Taking Bell here to his post." The guard glanced at David's ID, then at Mark. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowed. Mark held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Everything check out, Harris?" the guard asked. Harris, the guard David had identified as the most easily distracted, barely glanced at Mark's ID. "Looks good to me," he said, waving them through. Mark and David walked through the gate, their bodies tense, their minds racing. They were one step closer to freedom, but they weren't out of the woods yet. They still had to make it past the outer perimeter, past the guard towers, past the barbed wire fence. The journey was far from over, but they had cleared the first hurdle. Their hearts soared with a mix of relief and elation. They were going to make it. They were really going to make it. Or so they thought. The worst was yet to come. Just as they thought they were in the clear, a voice boomed out, stopping them in their tracks. It was Miller, the seasoned guard David had warned Mark about, the one with the sharp eyes and the uncanny ability to spot inconsistencies. "Bell, hold up a minute," Miller said, his voice laced with suspicion. David froze, his heart sinking. He turned to face Miller, trying to maintain his composure, but he could feel the sweat trickling down his back. "Everything all right, Miller?" David asked, trying to sound casual. "Just wondering what you're doing out here," Miller said, his eyes fixed on David. "I didn't see you on the duty roster." David's mind raced. He needed a believable explanation, and he needed it fast. He couldn't tell Miller the truth, of course. He had to come up with a lie, something that would satisfy his curiosity without raising any red flags. "I'm escorting Bell here to his post," David said, gesturing to Mark. "He's new, still learning the ropes. I'm just showing him around." Miller's eyes narrowed. He studied Mark intently, his gaze lingering on his face, his uniform, his ID card. Mark kept his head down, trying to avoid eye contact, but he could feel Miller's scrutiny like a physical weight. "Bell, huh?" Miller said, his voice skeptical. "Don't think I've seen you around before." Mark remained silent, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that one wrong word could blow everything. He had to trust David to handle the situation. "He just transferred in from another facility," David said, his voice firm and authoritative. "He's got all the paperwork. You can check it if you want." Miller hesitated for a moment, his eyes still fixed on Mark. David could see the wheels turning in his head, the suspicion simmering beneath the surface. "What post are you heading to, Bell?" Miller asked, his voice sharp and demanding. David knew that Mark didn't know the answer to that question. He had to improvise, to provide an answer that would satisfy Miller without revealing their plan. "He's heading to Tower 3, David said, his voice confident. "We're short-staffed tonight, so he's filling in." Miller considered this for a moment, his eyes still narrowed. David held his breath, waiting for the verdict. Finally, Miller nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Carry on." David breathed a sigh of relief. He had managed to convince Miller, at least for now. But he knew that Miller was still suspicious, that he would be watching them, waiting for them to slip up. "Thanks, Miller," David said, his voice cordial. "Have a good night." He turned to Mark, his eyes signaling him to move. Together, they walked away, their bodies tense, their minds racing. They had dodged a bullet, but they knew that the danger was far from over. Miller was still out there, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. They had to be extra careful, extra vigilant. The escape was still on, but the stakes had just been raised. They knew that the next encounter with Miller could be their last. The pressure was immense, but they refused to crack. They had come too far to give up now. Freedom was within reach, and they were determined to seize it, no matter the cost. David led Mark through the outer perimeter, past the guard towers and the barbed wire fence. The guards in the towers eyed them with suspicion, but David maintained his composure, projecting an air of authority. He knew that any sign of nervousness would betray them. They reached the final gate, the last obstacle standing between Mark and freedom. The guard on duty, a young man with a bored expression, barely glanced at them as they approached. "Just heading out for a patrol," David said, his voice casual. The guard nodded, his eyes fixed on a magazine. He waved them through without a second glance. Mark and David walked through the gate, their bodies trembling with a mixture of relief and disbelief. They had made it. They had actually made it. Mark was free. He took a deep breath of the night air, the scent of freedom filling his lungs. He looked back at the prison, a dark and imposing silhouette against the night sky. He had spent years within those walls, years of confinement and despair. Now, he was finally free. A wave of exhilaration washed over him, a sense of triumph and liberation. He had defied the odds, he had cheated the system, he had escaped. He had done the impossible. But the exhilaration was quickly tempered by a sense of uncertainty. He had no money, no possessions, no plan. He was a fugitive, a wanted man. He had no idea where to go, what to do, how to survive. He looked at David, his eyes filled with gratitude and uncertainty. David had risked everything for him, had sacrificed his career, his freedom, his entire future. He owed him his life. "Thank you," Mark said, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." David smiled, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "Just stay safe," he said. "And don't look back." He knew that they couldn't stay together, that it was too dangerous for both of them. Mark had to disappear, to start a new life, to leave the past behind. They embraced, a long, tight hug that spoke volumes. It was a moment of profound connection, a symbol of their renewed bond, a testament to the enduring power of family. David stepped back, his eyes filled with tears. "Good luck, Mark," he said. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Mark nodded, his heart heavy with emotion. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. He knew that he would never see David again, that their lives were destined to follow different paths. But he would never forget what David had done for him, the sacrifice he had made, the love he had shown. As he walked into the night, he felt a sense of hope, a glimmer of optimism. He had a second chance, a new beginning. He had to make the most of it, to prove that David's sacrifice had not been in vain. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was determined to face it with courage and resilience. He was free, and he intended to stay that way. His past was behind him. His future awaited. He would run. He would hide. But he would live. And he would never forget the brother who gave him back his life. David watched as Mark disappeared into the darkness, his heart heavy with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew that he had done the right thing, that he had saved his brother's life. But he also knew that he had just changed his own life forever. He turned and walked back towards the prison, his steps slow and deliberate. He could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him, the potential consequences looming large. He had betrayed his oath, he had broken the law, he had jeopardized his career and his freedom. He was now an accomplice to a fugitive, a criminal himself. As he walked through the prison gates, he could feel the eyes of the other guards on him, their gaze filled with suspicion and curiosity. He tried to act normal, to project an air of indifference, but he knew that they could sense something was wrong. He returned to his post, his mind racing, his nerves on edge. He knew that it was only a matter of time before the escape was discovered, before the investigation began, before the questions started. He had to be prepared, to have his story straight, to maintain his composure. He thought about Miller, about his sharp eyes and his uncanny ability to spot inconsistencies. He knew that Miller wouldn't let it go, that he would be watching him, waiting for him to slip up. He had to be extra careful, extra vigilant. He also thought about Johnson, about his suspicions and his veiled threats. He knew that Johnson was a man of ambition, a man who would do anything to get ahead. He wouldn't hesitate to turn David in if it meant advancing his own career. David knew that he was walking a tightrope, that one wrong move could send him plummeting into the abyss. He had to be strong, to be brave, to be willing to face the consequences of his actions. He looked around at the prison, at the cold, gray walls, at the barbed wire fence. He had spent years working in this place, years of order and discipline, years of following the rules. Now, he had shattered all of that, he had crossed the line, he had become an outlaw. He knew that his life would never be the same. He had sacrificed everything for his brother, and he had no regrets. He had done what he had to do, he had followed his heart, he had chosen family over duty. As he stood there, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had made a choice, and he would live with the consequences. He had saved his brother's life, and that was all that mattered. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation into Mark's escape intensified. Miller and Johnson questioned David relentlessly, scrutinizing his every move. He maintained his innocence, sticking to his story, but he could feel the net closing in. He knew that it was only a matter of time before they found out the truth. He had to be prepared for the inevitable. He had to be ready to face the music. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, in a small, dusty town, Mark was starting a new life. He had changed his name, altered his appearance, and found a job working as a mechanic. He kept to himself, avoiding attention, always looking over his shoulder. He knew that he was a wanted man, that the authorities were still searching for him. He had to be careful, to avoid any contact with his past, to stay one step ahead of the law. But despite the constant fear, he felt a sense of hope, a glimmer of optimism. He was free, he was alive, he had a second chance. He was determined to make the most of it, to build a new life for himself, to honor David's sacrifice. He often thought about his brother, about the risks he had taken, about the love he had shown. He knew that he would never be able to repay him, but he vowed to live a life that would make him proud. One evening, as he was walking home from work, he saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was someone from his past, someone who knew his secret. His heart skipped a beat, his body tensed. He knew that he had to run, to disappear, to start all over again. His life on the run would never truly let him be free. Back at the prison, David stood in the guard tower, looking out at the vast expanse of the night sky. He could see the distant lights of the town, the twinkling stars above. He felt a sense of solitude, a poignant awareness of the sacrifice he had made. He knew that he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison, paying the price for his actions. But he had no regrets. He had saved his brother's life, and that was all that mattered. He was at peace, knowing that he had done the right thing, that he had followed his heart, that he had chosen family over duty. The night was quiet, the stars were bright, and he was alone with his thoughts, forever bound to his brother by a shared secret, a shared sacrifice, a shared love.